My name is Sofia Ramirez. I'm 25 years old, born and raised in Guadalajara, Mexico. And if you had met me just a few years ago, I would have laughed if someone told me I'd one day be sharing my testimony about Jesus Christ. Not because I hated Christians, not because I was angry at God, but because I was absolutely convinced Christianity wasn't true. And what happened next changed everything. Before I tell you my story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been so sure about something that you stopped questioning it? Have you ever believed you had all the answers, only to discover you didn't even know the real question? Because that's exactly what happened to me. What I'm about to share isn't a story I expected to tell. It's a story that broke me, a story that saved me, a story that began with doubt and ended with a truth I could no longer ignore. And it all started in my small family home. As I tell you this, I'm sitting in the same living room where many of those moments happened. The same couch, the same walls, the same memories. Some beautiful, some painful, all unforgettable. Growing up, religion was everywhere around me. In Mexico, faith is woven into daily life. Crosses hung on walls, pictures of saints decorated homes, people prayed before meals, church bells echoed through the streets every Sunday morning. My grandmother was deeply religious. Every night she prayed for our family. Every morning she read from a worn Bible whose pages had become yellow with age. She often told me, "Mia, one day you'll understand how much God loves you." I always smiled politely, but inside, I wasn't interested. As I got older, I became fascinated with science, philosophy, and critical thinking. I loved asking difficult questions, questions many people seemed uncomfortable answering. Why does suffering exist? Why would a loving God allow children to die? Why are there so many religions? How can anyone know which one is true? The more I asked, the more I felt religious people gave weak answers. At least that's what I thought. By the time I entered university, I had become openly skeptical. I wasn't aggressive about it. I didn't go around attacking believers, but I enjoyed debates, and I especially enjoyed challenging Christians. Whenever someone mentioned God, I immediately started asking questions. Hard questions. Questions designed to expose contradictions. Questions designed to prove they were wrong. Most of the time, people couldn't answer. That only increased my confidence. Soon, I developed a reputation among friends. If you want your faith tested, they joked, talk to Sophia. And honestly, I was proud of it. I believed I was helping people escape what I saw as superstition. I thought faith was merely a psychological crutch, something people used because reality was too painful, something invented to make death less frightening. I considered myself rational, independent, enlightened. But looking back now, I realized something important. I wasn't actually searching for truth. I was searching for confirmation. There is a difference, a huge difference. Truth demands humility. Confirmation demands agreement. And at that time, humility was not my strength. Everything changed during my final year at university. One afternoon, I was sitting in the campus library working on a research project. Across from me sat a quiet student named Daniel. We had shared several classes, but never really spoken. Daniel was different. Calm, respectful, thoughtful. He wasn't loud about his beliefs. In fact, most people wouldn't even know he was a Christian unless they asked. That day, we started talking about philosophy. The conversation eventually moved toward religion. Normally, I would immediately begin challenging the other person, but Daniel surprised me. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't offended. He wasn't trying to win an argument. Instead, he listened. Then he asked me a question, a simple question, one that would stay with me for months. "Sophia, have you ever seriously examined the evidence for Christianity with the same intensity you've used to criticize it?" I laughed. Of course I had. Or at least I thought I had. But Daniel continued, "Not what other people say about Christianity, not social media opinions, not assumptions. Have you personally investigated the strongest case for it?" His words irritated me, because I didn't have a good answer. The truth was I had spent years reading arguments against Christianity, but very little time studying arguments for it. That realization bothered me more than I wanted to admit. My pride wouldn't allow me to ignore the challenge. So I made a decision that seemed harmless at the time. I would thoroughly investigate Christianity, not to become a believer, not even close. I wanted to prove once and for all that it was false. I wanted evidence, facts, historical records. logical arguments. I planned to expose Christianity so completely that nobody could challenge my conclusions. I had no idea that this decision would completely transform my life. The investigation began innocently enough. I bought books, watched debates, listened to scholars from both sides, studied history, studied archaeology, studied philosophy. For weeks, I immersed myself in research. At first, everything seemed normal. I expected my confidence to increase. Instead, something strange happened. Questions I thought were settled became complicated. Arguments I once considered weak became stronger. Certain assumptions I had carried for years started falling apart, and for the first time in my life, I felt genuinely uncomfortable. Not because I had found proof, but because I had discovered uncertainty. The certainty I once enjoyed was beginning to crack, and through those cracks, something unexpected was starting to shine. I didn't know it yet, but my journey toward Jesus had already begun. The deeper I went into my investigation, the more frustrated I became. I expected Christianity to collapse under scrutiny. Instead, I kept finding things I couldn't easily dismiss. One of the first topics I studied was the historical evidence surrounding Jesus. I had always assumed scholars debated whether Jesus even existed, but that wasn't what I found. To my surprise, even many non-Christian historians agreed that Jesus was a real historical figure. That discovery didn't prove Christianity was true, but it removed one argument I had relied on for years. Then I examined the crucifixion. Again, I expected uncertainty. Instead, I found overwhelming agreement among historians that Jesus had been executed by crucifixion under Roman authority. That fact wasn't particularly controversial. What became controversial was what happened afterward. The resurrection. The very idea sounded ridiculous to me. People don't rise from the dead. I knew that. Everyone knew that. So I focused my research there. I studied every alternative explanation I could find. Maybe the disciples lied. Maybe they hallucinated. Maybe the body was stolen. Maybe the stories were legends that developed over time. For weeks, I analyzed every possibility. Yet every explanation seemed to create new problems. I wasn't becoming convinced, but I was becoming unsettled, and I hated that feeling. One night I stayed awake until nearly 3 a.m. reading historical arguments. Stacks of books surrounded my bed. My laptop glowed in the darkness. Outside, rain tapped softly against my bedroom window. I remember closing a book and staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, I whispered something I never expected to say. What if I'm wrong? The words felt dangerous, almost forbidden. I immediately pushed the thought away. No, I wasn't wrong. I was just being objective. That's all. But deep inside, something had started changing. A few weeks later, life delivered a challenge much bigger than any intellectual debate. My father suffered a serious heart attack. It happened suddenly. One moment, everything seemed normal. The next moment, our family was rushing to the hospital. I still remember the sound of my mother's voice shaking as she called for help. I remember the flashing lights, the ambulance, the fear. Most of all, I remember feeling helpless, completely helpless. The doctors worked for hours. Family members gathered in waiting rooms. People cried, people prayed, and I sat silently in a plastic hospital chair trying to stay strong. But inside, I was terrified. My father had always been the strongest person I knew. He worked hard his entire life. He sacrificed for our family. He never complained. Seeing him connected to machines shattered something inside me. That night, my grandmother sat beside me. She held my hand. Her hands were old and wrinkled now. Hands that had spent decades praying. She looked at me with gentle eyes. Then she said something simple. "Sophia, let's pray." I almost refused. Prayer felt pointless. What difference could words possibly make? But I was exhausted, broken, scared, so I nodded. For the first time in years, I bowed my head. My grandmother prayed softly, not with fancy language, not with dramatic emotion, just honest words. She asked God to protect my father, to comfort our family, to give us strength. As she prayed, tears filled my eyes. I couldn't explain why. Nothing supernatural happened. The hospital room didn't suddenly light up. No voice came from heaven. Yet for some reason, I felt a strange sense of peace, a peace that didn't make logical sense. The situation hadn't changed. My father was still critically ill. The uncertainty remained. But something inside me felt different. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was emotional exhaustion, nothing more. Still, I couldn't forget that moment. Over the next several days, my father's condition slowly improved. The doctors remained cautious, but signs of recovery appeared. Our family felt relieved, thankful, hopeful. Everyone thanked God. I thanked the doctors. Yet a question lingered in my mind. Why had that prayer affected me so deeply? I couldn't answer. Months passed. My research continued. But now something else was happening. Christianity was no longer merely an intellectual subject. It was becoming personal. I started reading the Bible directly. Not because I wanted spiritual guidance. I wanted evidence, context, historical understanding. At least that's what I told myself. I began with the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Honestly, I expected to be bored. Instead, I became fascinated. Jesus wasn't who I expected him to be. Growing up, I had imagined Christianity as a collection of rules, a system designed to control people. But Jesus seemed different. He challenged religious hypocrisy. He cared about outcasts. He showed compassion to people society rejected. He forgave people who didn't deserve forgiveness. He spoke with authority unlike anyone I had ever encountered. Again and again, I found myself stopping and rereading passages, not because I believed them, because they affected me. His words carried weight, a strange kind of weight. One evening, I came across a verse that refused to leave my mind. "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I read it several times, then again, and again. Something about those words hit me unexpectedly, because despite everything I projected outwardly, I was tired. Very tired, pretending I had everything figured out. Tired of carrying anxiety. Tired of feeling responsible for solving every problem through logic alone. Tired of being strong all the time. For years I had built my identity around intelligence and independence. But beneath that confidence was loneliness, fear, pressure, pain I rarely admitted even to myself. And somehow those ancient words seemed to speak directly into those hidden places. That realization frightened me. I started avoiding the Bible for several days. I distracted myself with work, social media, entertainment, anything to avoid fronting what was happening inside me. But questions followed me everywhere. During lectures, while driving, while eating dinner, while lying awake at night. Questions about truth, questions about meaning, questions about God. One Friday evening, Daniel invited me to a small Christian gathering. I immediately said no. Then he smiled. No pressure, just listen. For reasons I still don't fully understand, I agreed. The meeting took place in a modest home. Nothing impressive, no giant stage, no flashy lights, no emotional manipulation, just ordinary people sharing their experiences. I listened as person after person described how faith had transformed their lives. Some stories involved addiction, others involved grief, broken families, depression, fear. Each testimony was different, yet there was one common theme: hope, real hope. Not wishful thinking, not denial, hope that had survived suffering. As I listened, I found myself wondering something I had never seriously considered before. What if these people weren't deluded? What if they had actually experienced something real? That question stayed with me all night. When I finally returned home, the house was quiet. Everyone else was asleep. I walked into my room and sat on the edge of my bed. The darkness felt unusually heavy. For several minutes, I simply stared at the floor. Then something happened that shocked me. Without planning to, without thinking about it, I began talking to God, not formally, not religiously, just honestly. God, if you're real. The words felt strange, awkward, almost embarrassing. I continued anyway. If you're really there, I need you to show me. Silence filled the room. Nothing happened, no miracle, no vision, no voice, just silence. Yet somehow I sensed that this simple prayer had crossed a line I could never uncross. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't debating God. I was searching for him, and deep down I had a feeling that he was already searching for me. The days after that prayer were some of the strangest days of my life. Nothing dramatic happened on the outside. I still attended classes. I still met friends. I still helped my family. To everyone around me, I looked exactly the same. But inside, a battle had begun. Part of me wanted answers. The other part was terrified of what those answers might mean. Because if Christianity was true, it wouldn't simply change my opinions. It would change everything. My identity, my worldview, my future. And honestly, I wasn't ready for that. So I tried to push it away. I buried myself in work. I spent hours scrolling through social media. I distracted myself with movies and music. anything to avoid the growing conviction inside my heart. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape one question. What if Jesus really is who he claimed to be? The question followed me everywhere. One afternoon, I was sitting alone in a cafe near campus. Rain tapped against the windows. People talked quietly around me. I opened my laptop and continued researching. I found myself reading the words of Jesus again. Then I came across a verse I had never paid much attention to before. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? I froze. For some reason, those words hit me like a punch to the chest. I read them again and again. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? Suddenly, I began thinking about my life, my ambitions, my plans, my dreams. I wanted success. I wanted financial security. I wanted recognition. I wanted people to admire me. But why? What was I really chasing? And if I achieved all those things, would I finally feel complete? Deep down, I already knew the answer. No, because despite all my confidence, despite my education, despite my achievements, there was still an emptiness inside me. A quiet emptiness I had spent years trying to ignore. That evening, I returned home feeling emotionally exhausted. My mother noticed immediately. "Are you okay?" she asked. I forced a smile. "I'm fine." But I wasn't, not even close. Over the next few weeks, the struggle intensified. Some nights I couldn't sleep. Questions raced through my mind. Questions about eternity, questions about purpose, questions about God. And then something happened that pushed me to my breaking point. A close friend from university died unexpectedly in a car accident. She was only 24. One day she was alive, the next day she was gone. Just like that. No warning, no preparation, no second chance. I attended the funeral in shock. The church was filled with grieving family members and friends. People cried openly. Others sat silently, unable to process what had happened. As I looked at her photograph near the front of the room, reality hit me with overwhelming force. Life is fragile, far more fragile than we realize. We spend so much time planning tomorrow, assuming tomorrow will come, yet none of us are promised tomorrow. For days after the funeral, I couldn't stop thinking about death. Not in a morbid way, in an honest way. For the first time, I confronted questions I had spent years avoiding. What happens after death? Does life have meaning beyond this world? Is there really a God? And if there is, am I ready to meet him? Those questions haunted me. One night, everything finally came crashing down. I had been carrying stress for months. Emotional stress, mental stress, spiritual stress. Eventually, it became too much. Around midnight, I sat alone in my bedroom. The house was quiet. Everyone else was asleep. Outside, the city lights glowed faintly through my window. I remember staring into the darkness, trying to think, trying to reason, trying to hold everything together, but suddenly, I couldn't. Years of pressure erupted all at once. I broke down completely. I started crying harder than I ever had before. Not polite tears, not controlled tears. The kind of crying that comes from deep inside your soul, the kind you can't stop. Every fear surfaced, every insecurity, every hidden wound, every disappointment, every regret. I felt overwhelmed by the weight of my own life. For years, I had presented myself as strong, independent, confident, but in that moment, I felt completely broken and completely alone. Eventually, I slid off my bed onto the floor. My hands were shaking, my heart was racing. I didn't know what else to do, so I prayed. Not because I had become a Christian, not because I suddenly had faith. I prayed because I had nowhere else to turn. God, I whispered through tears, if you're real. The words caught in my throat. I continued, I can't do this anymore. More tears came. The room remained silent, but I kept talking. I've spent my whole life trying to figure everything out on my own. I've tried to be strong. I've tried to have all the answers. I'm tired. For several minutes, I simply cried. Then I said something that changed my life forever. If Jesus is really who he says he is, please show me. At that moment, something happened that is difficult to describe. No, I didn't see a vision. No, I didn't hear an audible voice, but what happened was just as real. The crushing weight I had been carrying suddenly began lifting. Not all at once, not dramatically, but undeniably. Peace started filling the emptiness inside me, a peace unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't emotional excitement, it wasn't adrenaline, it wasn't wishful thinking. It felt deeper than emotions, deeper than thoughts. It felt as though someone was standing beside me saying, "You don't have to carry this anymore." I sat there in stunned silence. The tears slowly stopped, my breathing calmed. For the first time in months, maybe for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing: something had changed, something real. I stayed on the floor for nearly an hour, just sitting quietly, thinking, reflecting, feeling a sense of peace I couldn't explain. Before going to bed, I opened the Bible again, not as a skeptic, not as an investigator, but as someone searching for truth. My eyes landed on a verse I had never noticed before. "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." The words felt personal, as if they had been written directly for me. And for the first time, I realized something important. Maybe Christianity wasn't merely about evidence. Maybe it wasn't merely about arguments. Maybe it wasn't merely about winning debates. Maybe it was about a relationship with the God who created me, the God who knew me, the God who loved me even while I doubted him. That realization shook me. Because if it was true, then Jesus wasn't simply a historical figure. He was alive. And if he was alive, then everything was about to change. I had spent years trying to prove Christianity wrong. Now I was beginning to fear that it might actually be true. And strangely, that possibility no longer scared me. For the first time, it gave me hope. The morning after that night felt different. The sun rose like it always did. Cars moved through the streets. People rushed to work. Life appeared completely normal. Yet inside me, something had changed. For years, I had carried a constant weight, a pressure I barely noticed because it had become so familiar. Now that weight was gone. Not every problem had disappeared. My questions weren't all answered. My circumstances hadn't magically changed. But the emptiness that had followed me for years no longer felt the same. There was peace, real peace, and I couldn't explain it. For several days, I kept the experience to myself. Part of me feared talking about it, another part feared losing it. So I continued reading the Bible, not out of obligation, not because someone told me to, because I wanted to. Every evening after work and classes, I found myself opening the Gospels. The words felt alive in a way I couldn't describe. Passages I had previously ignored suddenly seemed meaningful. Stories I once dismissed suddenly felt personal. One night I read the account of the prodigal son, a young man who walked away from his father, who wasted everything, who believed he could live independently, who eventually found himself broken and lost. And yet when he returned home, his father didn't reject him. He ran toward him. He embraced him. He welcomed him back. As I read, tears filled my eyes. Because for the first time I saw myself in that story. I wasn't the hero. I wasn't the wise observer. I was the lost child. The one who spent years running, the one who thought she knew better, the one who believed she didn't need God, and yet somehow, despite all my doubts, despite all my pride, despite all my resistance, God had never stopped loving me. That realization overwhelmed me. I closed the Bible and cried quietly, not tears of sadness, tears of gratitude. For years, I had imagined God as distant, judgmental, angry, waiting for me to fail, but the God I was discovering looked very different. Patient, merciful, compassionate, loving. A few days later, I met Daniel for coffee, the same Daniel who had challenged me months earlier. As soon as he saw me, he smiled. "You look different." I laughed nervously. "Do I?" He nodded. "What happened?" For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. Then I simply told him the truth. "I think God is changing my heart." His eyes widened slightly, not in surprise, almost as if he had been expecting it. We talked for nearly 3 hours. For the first time, I wasn't debating. I wasn't arguing. I wasn't trying to win. I was listening, learning, searching. At the end of our conversation, Daniel asked a simple question. "Sophia, do you believe Jesus is who he claimed to be?" The question hung in the air. Months earlier, I would have immediately said no. Now I couldn't, because deep inside, I already knew the answer. I took a deep breath. Then I whispered the words, "Yes." Saying it out loud felt surreal, like crossing a bridge that could never be uncrossed. Daniel smiled. Then he asked another question. "If you believe that, what's stopping you from giving your life to him?" I didn't answer immediately, because I knew exactly what was stopping me. Fear. Fear of change. Fear of what others would think. Fear of surrender. Fear of losing control. But another realization suddenly hit me. I had spent years trying to control my own life, and it hadn't brought me peace. Maybe surrender wasn't weakness. Maybe surrender was freedom. That night, back in my room, I knelt beside my bed, the same place where months earlier I had challenged God, the same place where I had cried on the floor, the same place where everything had begun changing, and there, with tears in my eyes, I prayed from my heart, not a memorized prayer. Not religious words, just honesty. Jesus, I believe you are real. I believe you died for my sins. I believe you rose again. I've spent years fighting you. I've spent years running from you. I'm sorry. The tears came again, but this time they felt different. Lighter, freer. I continued, I don't want to live for myself anymore. I give you my life. Lead me, change me, teach me. I belong to you. The moment wasn't dramatic, no lightning, no earthquake, no voice from heaven, but something happened inside me. A certainty, a peace, a joy, a sense of coming home. For years I had searched for truth. That night I found a person, and his name was Jesus. The weeks that followed were not perfect. In fact, some things became harder. Friends who once admired my skepticism were confused. A few mocked my decision. Some assumed I had become emotional or irrational. Others believed I had joined a cult. One friend actually laughed and said, "So after all those years arguing against Christianity, you became one of them?" I smiled, because honestly, I understood their reaction. Months earlier, I would have reacted the same way. Yet something remarkable happened. Their criticism no longer controlled me, because I had found something more valuable than approval. I had found peace. The hardest conversation was with my family. One evening, I gathered them in the living room. My parents sat together. My younger brother looked confused. My grandmother quietly watched. My hands trembled. Then I told them everything. My research, my doubts, my prayers, my encounter with God, my decision to follow Jesus. When I finished speaking, the room fell silent. For several seconds, nobody said anything. Then something happened that I'll never forget. My grandmother started crying, real tears. She covered her face with her hands. I immediately became worried. "Abuela, are you okay?" She nodded through tears. Then she said words that still make me emotional today. "For 15 years, she paused, trying to compose herself. "For 15 years I prayed every day that you would know Jesus." The room became silent again. I couldn't speak. Neither could she. Finally, she looked at me and smiled. I never stopped praying. At that moment, I realized something profound. While I was busy trying to prove Christianity wrong, people were praying for me. While I was arguing, God was pursuing me. While I was running, He never stopped searching. Months turned into a year, and the transformation continued. Not because I became perfect. Far from it. I still made mistakes. I still struggled. I still had questions. But I was no longer alone. The anxiety that once dominated my life gradually lost its grip. The fear that controlled my future began fading. Forgiveness replaced bitterness. Hope replaced emptiness. Purpose replaced confusion. For the first time, I understood that faith wasn't about pretending life was easy. Faith was about knowing who walks with you through difficult seasons, and that made all the difference. Looking back now, I sometimes laugh at the irony of my story. I started my journey determined to destroy Christianity. I wanted evidence against Jesus. I wanted proof he wasn't real. Instead, I discovered evidence I couldn't ignore, truth I couldn't escape, love I couldn't explain, and a savior I couldn't forget. Today, as I sit in this same house telling you my story, I often think about that younger version of myself. The girl who thought she had all the answers. The girl who believed faith was foolish. The girl who spent years trying to prove Christianity wrong. If I could speak to her now, I would gently tell her this. You don't have to be afraid of the truth, because the truth has a name, and his name is Jesus Christ. I didn't find him because I was good enough. I didn't find him because I was religious enough. I didn't find him because I deserved him. I found him because he never stopped reaching for me. And if you're listening to my story today, wondering whether God could ever love someone like you, please hear me. He can. I know, because he loved someone like me, the skeptic, the doubter, the girl who fought him for years. And somehow, through grace I will never fully understand, he turned my search for reasons to reject him into the very journey that led me into his arms. That is why I can honestly say, I tried to prove Christianity wrong. Then everything changed.